Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the First Responders Wellbeing Summit. My name is Dane. I'm the Chair of Wellbeing Australia, and on behalf of the entire team at Wellbeing Australia, we are so deeply honoured to bring you this important seminar focusing on the first responders' wellbeing. Our themes for the summit are really important and very closely held to us. They are living well through finding connection, both with yourself as well as with those that are important in your wellbeing journey. Secondly, to build hope, which we think is absolutely critical for good wellbeing. And most importantly, and thirdly, is building a sense of community, that making sure that you don't feel isolated, that you understand that there are other people that feel the same way, and connecting you to them, whether they be in your own agency or group or in another. So we really are honoured and proud to have an incredible lineup of speakers, an amazing agenda this week. Before I get to introducing our speakers for today, a couple of points I just wanted to make. For those of you not familiar with Wellbeing Australia, we're a national not-for-profit. There are a few things that make us different. The first is we're not a service provider, so we're not here to sell any service or one specific way of doing things. We really do believe that by people sharing their stories and really speaking with each other and connecting, that your solutions may be found, and that for each person, your well-being, what makes up your well-being is such an individual and unique recipe that there's no one size fits all, there's no magic formula, but it's really a journey of your discovery for yourself. The second thing that I think makes us very different is that, unlike some great groups and organizations that work very well with crisis situations, we believe very strongly in the fact that it's important to proactively manage your well-being and build that resilience and that hygiene factor into your well-being when times are good, so that when you are in crisis, when you are confronted or feeling overwhelmed, that you have some reserves to draw on, but also that you understand what it is that you need in order to manage your well-being. The third thing I think that's really important to mention is that we're financially independent. We are funded completely by our members. We are a volunteer-based organisation that receives only member funding, and so we're not aligned with any government, any agency, or any specific agenda. So it's with that in mind that we lead into today's discussion. Once again, before I just introduce our speakers, I want to please notify you of a couple of things. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. If you would like to pose a question to the panel, and we really do encourage you to today, that's what makes these discussions so worthwhile. And we've asked both of our speakers and presenters today to share personal stories, and it's a conversation, a chat that hopefully delivers great value to you. So please do pose questions, and if you pose them in the Q&A section, they'll be anonymous if you'd like them to be. You can add your name if you'd prefer, but they can be anonymous. However, all conversation and comments made in the chat function, just so you're aware, are visible to everybody. So just be mindful of that. If you do want to remain anonymous with your comments or questions, please rather pose them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function. Excellent. So I would love to introduce and open the session for this afternoon. The title for today's session is My Why, When Purpose, Values and Work Collide. And we have two incredible speakers today. The first is Mark Crosweller. Welcome, Mark. Lovely to have you with us. Mark is currently the Director of Ethical Intelligence and also Senior Advisor to KPMG. But Mark has an incredibly rich history as a first responder. He's the former Director General of Emergency Management Australia, and also was head of the National Resilience Taskforce. So Mark is a veteran in this space. He's spent 36 years in crisis and emergency management. Mark, we're absolutely delighted to welcome you. And I'll just introduce Gayl and then hand over to you for some introductory comments and remarks. We're also joined today by the Reverend Gayl Mills. Gayl is the principal chaplain for the AFP and an incredible resource and incredible force behind our topic today. Gayl was kind enough to be on our steering committee and was very passionate about bringing you the summit session today, which speaks really about those very, very difficult times when your sense of purpose collides with the different situations you find yourself in, and that can leave you feeling so confused and overwhelmed. But lots to get to. Before we get there, let me hand it over to you, Mark. Welcome. Thank you so much for your time today, and please give a few little introductory remarks, and then I'll hand it over to Gayl.
Certainly, thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the great privilege to talk to you today about such an important topic. I'm not sure who's online because it's a bit hard to see. We're not in a theatre or an audience, but I'm sure I would be familiar to at least some of the people. I think the first thing I'd say about a career in emergency management and crisis and national security is that we don't get through our careers unscathed. There's no doubt about that. I think having travelled and seen and lived and experienced much human suffering and difficulty across that 36 years, it's often difficult to separate the personal from the professional. And the bottom line is, Donna, I don't think we should do that, actually. I think that really what we undertake as first responders is a great mission. It's a great honour to be in service of others. And we do pay a price for that. I think what my career taught me was that the nature of suffering, that suffering did exist, that all lived experiences were ultimately worthwhile. What I derived from those lived experiences, and often the very painful ones, of course, through post-traumatic stress and other challenges, was the importance of hope, faith, love, meaning, and purpose. Those things help to define, I guess, who I was, who we are, what we do, why we do it. And it's the absence of those things that makes life really tough. So the lived experience for me, particularly through my mid-30s when post-traumatic stress turned up, and it was not well understood in those days. That was back in 1994. And having to navigate that pretty much on my own with very little institutional support, in fact, no institutional support because there were no diagnostic tools available in those days, was ultimately a revelation. But a very difficult period to travel through. I think, having spoken to many people in the sector about those challenges around post-traumatic stress, and we'll talk today also a bit about moral injury as well, is that they generally say two things. They say, I wouldn't change the experience for anything, so they learn something or learn a lot, and they hope they never have to go through it again. So it's almost a paradox. And I found that, the depth of experience that crisis takes us to really does actually show us what we're capable of, what we can navigate if we turn our minds and our hearts to those challenges, and also the extent to which it allows us to relate to other humans and non-humans as well, I've got to say. I mean, we are expanding our insights and our knowledge and our ethics and our concern beyond the human realm to the non-human realm, to animals, to the ecology, to the planetary system. I think all of that is good. Not to get too big or scalar about it, but if my career taught me nothing else, it was to say that suffering did exist, and the pathway out of suffering was to be a compassionate human being. And what it was to be in the sector was to really profoundly learn to understand what that meant. And what I was able to do is to take any experience of difficulty or suffering and draw from it the lessons, of the virtues, that to be kind, to be patient, to be considerate, to be compassionate. All of those virtues were all mixed up in this, what looked like a mess of suffering and difficulty. One thing that was consistent through all of it was the capacity to be virtuous, the capacity to profoundly understand the nature of the human experience, to draw lessons from that and to apply that in helping other people. And I've often said that for a first responder, when we turn out and we come across someone who's requires our assistance, we often take the view that we're the rescuer. We have some sense of superiority to us, and I don't say that in a critical way or a judgmental way, but there's some sort of sense of superiority that we're there to help. Now, of course, we are there to help, but more importantly, we're actually in relationship the minute we turn up and help somebody. So, and if you think about meaning and purpose and why we do what we do, we derive enormous sense of identity and meaning and purpose from assisting others. But we only get to do that because of the unfortunate circumstance that someone else finds themselves in. So it's actually a space of mutuality. So there's a relationship between a person of unfortunate circumstance and our possibility of fulfilling our mission, our purpose, our sense of being in assisting that person in that regard. So it's an equitable exchange of humanity that goes on. It's not a hierarchical, paternalistic or patronizing space. It's a space of shared understanding. And I've also seen in the course of that sometimes those who we regarded as a victim were probably more courageous than we were. That, we had training, we had PPE and equipment and systems and procedures and institutions sitting behind us to help us. Then those we're assisting had none of that, but still had the courage to endure what they were enduring. So when I learned that, Donna, I think everything changed for me, and those hardships I've been through in emotional and mental health and everything else had meaning, had purpose, had value. And I draw, even to this day, I continue to draw from them and help others to draw from them as well. We might have a bit of a look at that throughout the course of today's session. You're on mute.
It had to happen. It had to happen. Thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate that. Such valid comments and so much to come back to. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Gayl, to hand over to you, you were so passionate about making sure that this session was on the agenda, and would love to introduce you to the audience, learn a little bit about you and why you thought this session would be so important to include in the summit.
Oh, thank you, Donna. It really is a privilege to be here. Thank you. Well, I guess, I have a journey to becoming a chaplain. I used to be a medical scientist and became chaplain with the AFP 16 years ago. I've had people say to me, what happened to your brain and things like that, which brings up that societal concept of, the conflict between faith and science. But I really, when I listened to Mark, and I've spoken with him before, I just resonate so much with everything he's saying. I don't have PTSD, but I do think I have some moral injury, as he discussed there. But certainly my journey with the Australian Federal Police has taught me so much. I have had the privilege of listening to people and just being able to be around with people, while they're working, going out to critical jobs or incidents, or, just being in the station. And I have learnt so much about compassion, kindness, tolerance, about all those things from our police officers over the years. I guess when I started, I thought, oh, well, I'll be going in to help everybody. But that hasn't been how it is. I hope I've been of some assistance to people, but I don't think the people in the AFP, I've said it often enough, really can understand the lessons they have taught me about those things, which is incredibly exciting to learn from them. I've probably had the best discussions ever about God, the world, the universe, with police officers and other people in the AFP. I think some of the things that Mark is saying are so true. I think when we suffer, I think the oldest question in the world is there some sort of higher being, higher power? And I think the second oldest question in the world is why me? Because that is our natural reaction when something goes wrong, something is bad, something unexpected happens to us, then we, especially if we're trying to be good people, the question of why do bad things happen to good people is a huge question with no obvious answers. And I think it's a very natural reaction. But my own journey through life and and I've been surprised at how many people say this to me, that although it probably feels better, would have been better maybe not to have the bad experience, or as Mark says, you certainly don't want it again. So many people say, this good came out of it, or this happened, and it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had that experience. So there's tremendous capacity to learn, as Mark's saying, to grow in those situations where we can find unknown depths in ourselves, and we can actually also, I guess, from other people, find unknown compassion that we didn't think existed, care and support. And I guess, you know, one of the things that I think comes to me often too is that we are not defined by what happens to us. People have terribly bad things happen to them, and yet that doesn't define who we are. We're not confined by that, a definition or a diagnosis or something that has happened to us. We are so much more than that. And yes, we can acknowledge that this really bad thing has happened to us, but we don't have to be limited by it. We are so much more than a diagnosis or an incident. And that's not trying to take away from people's pain and suffering when they've been through terrible incidents, but it's an aspect that sometimes gets overlooked when people are caught up in the pain or even in the journey following on. That can become an identity, which isn't always helpful for them because it can stop them from recovering and moving forward. Yes, and I guess, as I've probably said in the session yesterday, it's just been such a privilege to be there listening to people and hearing their stories and offering that listening ear to hear what happens to some people, what they've been through. It's certainly an amazing experience.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gayl. Really appreciate that. And it sounds like you bring such an incredible perspective and richness to the work you do. I think the issue of the deep, deep, deep sense of purpose that many first responders have is such a pervasive calling, really, to, I think, this work. And yet, at the same time, sometimes becomes the enemy, in that it's from a well-being perspective can be very difficult to manage. Mark, you've spoken about that a little. I want to get back to you on that and really ask, do you think that first responders as a result then, because of that deep sense of why and purpose, have that natural tendency in certain situations to clash with the work they're doing and the situations that they find themselves in where that may not be congruent with their sense of purpose or why?
Look, I think so, absolutely. I think they we're sort of moving to the space of potential for moral injury. I think those of us drawn to the sector, I think most of humanity, certainly anthropologically, is compassionate in nature as an intrinsic part of being human. So we have since time immemorial moved to help each other. And if you think about it anthropologically, we've got no poison, we can't bite, we're pretty useless with our clothes on and a weapon in our hands. So the only reason we've survived such a tumultuous existence really over the last 70,000 years is because we pulled together and helped each other through great adversity. So it's a very, very much a part of who we are as humans. But I think for first responders, it's probably a little bit more so. I think it's like a calling. I think what happens is when we're recruited or as we enter the services, there's this very, very public image of what it means to be a police officer or a firefighter or an SES worker or what have you, a volunteer or paid career, doesn't matter. Or any other associated role around those things, of course, because there are many roles that are in place to support those agencies. And so it's a very attractive proposition. It's promoted and it's marketed that way. But often what we find is when we enter the cultures of these organisations that it doesn't quite line up and that there's potentially other things going on. And there's a range of reasons why that happens. So much of that is social and cultural, of course. It's not necessarily simply an abrogation of personal leadership responsibility or accountability at upper levels, although that is part of it. But I have seen people become dismayed or disenfranchised or sort of hurt, I suppose, by what they stood for and then what they find. And I think for me, what it really highlights is how complex ethics, morality really is. That, you know, I'm yet to see in my 36 years someone who, you know, principally hasn't gone to work to try and do the best they could in sometimes the worst of circumstance. I mean, you know, we kind of get that when we turn out to incidents, and, you know, sometimes as Gayl said, we see horrendous things, and sometimes we have to share in that in deeper ways than we would otherwise expect. But what I think my career taught me was when there was a moral rupture or a misalignment of morality or ethics, you know, say my ethics to the organisational ethics, over time I realised that I think two things: that I actually didn't have a clear understanding of my own moral compass. And I'm not saying I wasn't moral or ethical, but it was to say that if I was to describe or to give depth, colour, shape, form and meaning to my moral compass or my ethical premise, I would struggle to do it. So I might have the words, but did I really understand the depth of those words? So did I really understand deeply what it meant to be compassionate or to be trustworthy or to be kind? And the answer would have to be no. You know, earlier in my career, no. Those things, I had a propensity for those things and they were important to me, but to the extent I really understood them, no, there were some gaps there. And the other thing I learned was that, ironically, almost paradoxically, all things happen for a reason. And when things don't go well ethically or morally, or there's a rupture or a disjunct, it's really important to ask the why question. You know, why is that so? Because we often have, you know, overly simplistic views of good and evil or what's right and what's wrong. I think for most people, it's pretty obvious what's right and wrong, you know, when it's starkly presented before us. You know, taking another life is wrong. You know, there can be mitigating circumstances in the eyes of the law and perhaps in the eyes of certain theologies and philosophies. But at the end of the day, most people would say it's, you know, not right to take a life, and that's pretty clear cut. But that's not the stuff that we normally have to navigate with our ethics and our morals in our organisations. And ethics particularly does its best work when you're trying to find the difference between good and good, or between good and greater good, or between right and greater right, or marginal notions of right and wrong. So, for example, you can use the debates of pro-life and abortion, you know, as an extreme example of two versions of good, depending upon your perspective. That's what makes the debates so difficult, because it's not as black and white as right and wrong. It is in some people's minds, of course, but if you take it at a collective social conscience level, it's much more complex. So I think when people feel uncomfortable about what's happening morally, I think that's a good thing. So that's the moral intuition going off. So we have moral intuition. It's important to honour it. When things are ruptured or it upsets us, you know, moves us towards anger, we should listen to that. But then we should ask the why question about why is that happening? What's going on for those other people that they have breached a moral code or an ethical premise, or they're moving us in a direction that I don't agree with, that I can't line up with? Answering that why question closes that gap of hurt, and it closes the gap of injury. It may still leave you with a sufficient gap where you say, look, I don't want to be here anymore, actually, because the gap is too great. But often, particularly as you move up in leadership and you move more towards having to deal with politics, you'll find that ethics becomes very grey, morality becomes almost amoral, virtues get relegated to the private realm of the individual, and they kind of disappear from public life altogether. And you still have to navigate ethically your leadership and your decision making. So the why question becomes even more important as you progress through your career and you move into those complexities of leadership and politics, to try and get to the heart of why is that thing happening. As I said, it closes the gap, takes a bit of the pressure off, allows you to reframe and reposition. And if you can't do that, it's probably an exit point for you, or a redirection of your career. But it's not healthy to stay in it if you can't reconcile with it. If you can't find a sense of peace and comfort, if you can't find a bit of middle ground there, and it's still offensive and affronting to your moral compass, then it's time to exit yourself from the potential for injury.
And Mark, have you got an example of when you faced a situation like that? How do people go about understanding the why from somebody else? Is it as simple as walking up to them and saying, I don't understand why you did what you did. Could you please explain it to me? What in your experience has been a good way to understand that so you can move past that?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it, to ask the person themselves. But I think also it's about an educational process about the complexity of ethics. And I'm not saying everyone should go and become an ethicist. Not for a minute am I suggesting that. But to give a reasonably recent example, when I was head of Taskforce, I have done for about 10 years, dealt with in the space of Commonwealth state relations and international relations. And particularly in Commonwealth state relations, it can get a bit argy-bargy because there's such strong political identity with states and territories versus the Commonwealth. There's a contestation of taxation dollars, and there's always Liberal and Labor politics that turns up somewhere because we're not totally unified in our party politics across the country. So can be a pretty tough space. And I remember being in a meeting where there was a lot of and I hate to say it because this is about going into the depths of these things. There was a lot of inappropriate behaviour and language going on, and people exhibiting very, very unhelpful attributes, if you like, while we're trying to deal with a rather complex policy issue. And I remember saying to myself at the time, I'm not going to let compassion leave the room here because compassion is very important to me, but I couldn't get it front and centre because of the amount of anger and language that was being used in the room at the time. So I stood back and I said, well, why is this so? What's the cause of this? And the answers are many, of course, and sometimes we don't know the exact answer, but it became really clear that some of the people I was dealing with were struggling to hold competency on the issue, on the policy issues. They were really struggling to put up cogent arguments as to why something couldn't be the way that the Prime Minister had requested it. So when they started to lose competence on the issue and competence on their debate, they resorted to inappropriate behaviour and language in order to try and win the day. And of course, most people would know that once you turn to those tactics, you've lost the argument anyway. So I was able to see the suffering in them and to understand that, they were trying to save face, they were trying to hold ground, they were losing ground. It was a desperate act. It was really unhelpful. It was harmful to some people in the room. I had to navigate all of that. I just wouldn't let compassion leave the room. And then about half an hour later, when things settled, I was able to bring compassion back in, bring the conversation back to the middle ground and negotiate the position. And so I could have taken offence. I could have shut down the meeting and walked away and said inappropriate. I had that right, of course. I could have done that as the chair of the meeting. But I didn't. And I thought, let's see if we can get this back to somewhere safer, somewhere more appropriate. And so it was all about ethics. It was ultimately what we're trying to do is, reduce the suffering of the nation in the space of crisis. There were people in the room that were suffering. There were people exhibiting that suffering. I was able to see it, understand it, contextualise it to the extent I was able, and do something about it. So it's just a really simple example, Donna, but these things turn up all the time. Adversity exists almost as a continuum, really. I mean, all we see when incidents happen is we see an amplification of the attributes that already exist. So people have a propensity to be this way. That I've said for a long time that a crisis doesn't create character; it highlights it. So if someone's going to rant and rave and scream, then that's part of their character. It's not turning up because of an issue; it's turning up because there's work to do on the characterization of their leadership. So that's kind of one example or insight. But virtue ethics, which is the ethics that I speak to, is ethics of character as opposed to ethics of duty and rules or ethics of outcome. And it is fundamental to the way we lead and see the world, is to be really intimately understanding of what's important to us and how we can use those ethics in difficult times. So often with moral injury or moral rupture, there's still space to be ethical. There's still space to bring forward moral courage and to speak. And sometimes speak loudly and firmly and assertively about what is right and wrong and have your voice heard. A lot of people don't feel as though they have the courage to do that. And I understand why, because the workplace is pretty brutal. Virtue is not really tolerated at the moment in neoliberal Western societies that really are only interested in delivery outcomes. How we get there is not so important these days, and the leadership attributes to deliver on that are even less important in some environments. And so if you're going to come at it from a personally ethical viewpoint, then you do need some wisdom and some courage about how to do that. And I think it's important to learn those things as people progress through their careers. About, I say to leaders all the time, upon what ground do you stand? What makes you tick? What are the ethics? What's your moral compass look like? What are the ethics that are important to you, and to what extent do you understand them and their complexity? Because they'll get you out of a pickle every time, but you need to understand them intimately, and how important they are to the characterization of your leadership.
Wow. Thank you, Mark. Just so much wisdom, experience. And, I think that you've spoken so much around virtue and the ethics, and I'd love to come back to you on that. One of the things, though, I just wanted to switch to Gayl for a moment is, Mark has spoken quite a lot about this term moral injury. And Gayl, you had mentioned earlier that you feel that you have suffered a moral injury. We'd be really interested to understand, what do you mean by that, firstly? And secondly, how did it play out and affect you and other first responders?
Well, I think many people haven't heard the term moral injury in our community. Most of the research that's been done into moral injury has been largely in defence organisations across the world. And the last probably 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot more research done into first responders and moral injury. So basically, when people are put in positions where they have to transgress their own worldview, their own moral ethics that Mark is talking about, when they've either stood by and not spoken up, when, like Mark is saying, or haven't been able to do something in a situation that just goes against the very grain of who they are. And also it can happen organisationally when they're given orders to do something, or they see leaders behave in a way that transgresses the values. And most large organisations have values that are usually largely displayed. And I think certainly for me, it's probably been organisationally in some of the negotiations I've had with the organisation. It's not been any particular incident as such. It's been an ongoing trying to organise, to negotiate even things perhaps within the chaplaincy. So it's ended up rubbing against my worldview. Doesn't mean my worldview is right, but it's transgressed for me. I think, with our first responders, they are often put in situations where they're in places where they've got to respond in a certain way. There'll be rules and regulations and orders on how they are to be in any situation. But as we know, most of life is grey. So rules and regulations, if you're actually on the spot trying to be in a situation that nobody quite knows how it's going to play out, then rules and regulations don't always completely fit what's happening. So people can end up being in a situation where there's unexpected injury to a colleague or death of a colleague that was unintentional, but it's been as a result of that, and they feel of maybe orders that were given, or they feel like they couldn't do enough. And I think in organisations where there's a clash against this, where people might feel that they're doing their utmost best, because most of the recruits that come in, they're so bright and shiny, and they will say, I want to make things better, I want to give back, I want to help. So that's their primary motivation. And then sometimes when they find they're constrained in how they can do it, then they can end up seeing a lot of things that fill their bucket but some of it can be in maybe how they were dealt with about it later, or how they're able to be best cared for afterwards. But they might find that they're in a situation which actually rates right against their worldview, their moral compass, their ethics. And so I think most people that work in a military or paramilitary organisation have encountered something like that. It doesn't always cause somebody moral injury, but it can cause them deep distress as well.
Interesting. Thank you, Gayl. I think there's, so much value in what you're saying, because I think, people come in with such a deep sense of purpose, and the relationship that has to people's values is very often so inextricably linked, and how they can separate those sometimes or deal with conflict within those, I think is such a complex issue. So thank you, really insightful thoughts. Mark, to come back to you, and so many questions flowing in, so I'd love to get to some of them, but also, I think there's so much richness in this discussion. We could probably would need to schedule follow-ups, because so many questions in my mind, and I think in the minds of the audience. But so, Mark, you've mentioned a few times how to be virtuous, and what virtue means. And is that the same as a moral compass? Is it the same as your morality or your ethics? Would really like to understand a little more what you mean about what it is to be virtuous and why it's so important in the first responder space.
Yeah, certainly. It's actually a very old word. It's virtue. It's been around a couple of thousand years. It was very prominent in theology and religion for a long time, right up until about probably the early 1700s, when we essentially changed our philosophical premise as humans. So we had a very religious orientation to our ethics, and we derived our morality from the churches, and rightfully so. And and they continue to be a rich source of our morality and our ethical considerations. But the Enlightenment period took us from virtue and a faith-based premise of ethics and morality to one of reason and logic, to duties and rules, to rational thought, and ultimately to outcome, particularly as we move through the industrial period into a bigger and better world, that we realised that we could have a much bigger impact on people with the things that we were doing industrially, and that sort of opened up the need for ethics of outcome, so the greatest good for the greatest number, for example. So the virtues were then sort of relegated by those philosophers back to the churches, and then back to the monasteries, and ultimately into the private realm until about 1956, and then they started returning in normative philosophical debate by interestingly female philosophers who went into what was essentially Aristotelian philosophy and modernized it into what was in the 20th century thought. And it's been flourishing ever since. It also derives itself deeply from Buddhist thought, of course. And in Buddhist thought, as in Christian thought also, virtues are fundamental to how you see the world. So they've got a rich history in our philosophy and our theologies, and they've withstood the test of time. They are predominantly universal. So they may have some social and cultural nuance, but essentially they're universal. So they're shared across cultures, they're shared across time, they're shared across politics, for example. So the first thing I'd say about it, virtues are morals and ethics. And I often make the distinction to help people between those two words that are mixed up all the time. Ethics and morals get mixed up all the time. Even academia mixes them up. But look, ethics is essentially what's good, right, and just for you. Morals is what's good, right, and just for us. Values are what motivates us and moves us forward. And principles are those things that we base our arguments upon. There's the best way to disaggregate it. So ethics is about what's good, right, and just for us. It forms our character. It's very important that, we have a characterization of who we are as part of our identity. And a big part of that is our moral compass. So So Clive Hamilton, who wrote a book called The Freedom Paradox, makes a really interesting insight. He says, if you had all of the freedoms in the world and there was no consequence, so you could do whatever you liked, essentially, he said two things would happen. He said the first thing is you wouldn't be able to move because there'd be too much choice. He said, but secondly, it'd be worse than that, you wouldn't know who you were, because we actually define ourselves by what it is that we will and won't accept. Is a big part of shaping identity. So when people do things that we don't accept, you know, it affronts our identity. It affronts who we see ourselves as being, if you like. So the virtues speak to things like trust, compassion, humility, forgiveness, kindness, patience. The things that Aristotle said moves you to human flourishing, that moves you towards happiness. And the Buddha said the same thing. And much of Buddha's thought is predicated really on where the human mind, does it navigate the world virtuously, or does it tend to move to non-virtue? So things like anger and vitriol and attachment and ignorance and those things. And the mind kind of moves between the non-virtuous and the virtuous worlds all the time. It's constantly doing that. And Aristotle said the same thing. If you moved away from your virtue, you move towards your suffering. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So if you read, you read theology, you know, you read some of the great theological texts, or you read Buddha's thought, you'll feel better. You go, there's something about that. And if you think about it, you know, Buddhist thought, Christian thought, Islamic thought has been around for 2,500, 2,000 and 1,500 years, for example. That's where we draw most of our virtue from. And we still talk about those things. They're still shaping societies. They're still shaping culture, you know, some 2,500 years or whatever later. So they've got a lot to say, and they're important. And they've guided us throughout society. So I think, to answer your question, Donna, I think a moral compass is about saying, well, what is important to me that moves me towards a greater sense of purpose of being and happiness? I know that because when I'm at work and I'm showing compassion, or I'm showing kindness, or I'm helping somebody, I feel good about it. I feel better. The big challenge is that how do you then convert that into your private life? See, I think those of us who are in or been in uniform or support those in uniform can quite easily be compassionate to strangers, because there's a whole institutional thing that sits behind us, and expectation and sense of glory and public recognition. The bigger question is, what does that look like in the private realm of the home, or the relationship, or the friendships, or whatever? And that's where virtue really ought to be doing its best work. So we can publicly show it through our careers, and we get acknowledged and receive accolades for doing that, and that's fair enough. But the real test is, what are we like behind closed doors? What are we like when we drop the uniform? And often, I think, unfortunately, people can't carry the virtuous nature of their career orientation into their personal life. And that's why I come back to the point of saying to people, and the people I work with, you know, quite high levels in coaching or whatever, is to say, look, what does your moral compass actually look like? And you'd be astounded how many people can't articulate it. It doesn't make them bad people, but it does make them somewhat ignorant of what's really important to them. They don't fully appreciate or understand that it is their moral compass that actually leads them to a happier world, a better place to be, and gives them the courage to speak up when they need to. And, you know, we often, we hear the word wisdom a lot, but we don't really, we write it off in the West. We think that's being a smarty pants. You know, no one's wise, you know, no one's allowed to be wise because no one's that clever. Well, that's not what particularly Eastern thought has to say about wisdom. And even Aristotle said that you derive wisdom from your own lived experience, from your own journeys and your own adventures and your own sufferings is where you learn what it means to be truly human. And, you know, Aristotle said the unexamined life is not worth living. The Buddha said very similar things, that in order to be virtuous, one must reflect and understand the sufferings and the pains and the ills that we've navigated and traveled through. And what did we learn from them? You know, there is beauty in every experience.
Yeah.
There really is.
And Mark, how do you find that moral compass? You mentioned that earlier on in your own career, you felt you didn't have it. So for the audience and the loved ones, the first responders themselves, how do you find it?
For me, it was there were just unanswered questions. The Gayl's point before, you know, about the really big questions in life. You know, where did I come from? What am I doing here? Where am I going? The eschatological questions of life I had been through a lot in my 30s around post-traumatic stress and divorce and loss of all my assets, and all sorts of stuff were happening in my private life at the same time as I was trying to navigate a career. And I did play the role of a victim on some level. I sort of said, why is all this happening to me, to Gail's point earlier? And then, it dawned on me one day that what if this was happening for me? What if this wasn't to me, it was for me? What if I could turn this around and say, no, hang on a minute, there's merit here. And I had an inkling about that. It wasn't all bad. There was paradox and irony turning up, which used to make me chuckle sometimes. I used to find, almost call it black humor, but there was irony in what was going on if I allowed myself to look at it. So I realized that when things happen in the world, we tend to personalize it, and we tend to think it's only happening to us. So there could be something in the world that happens spatially and temporally, so time and place, that's unique to the world, and that's a true statement. That car accident or whatever is unique to the world in time and space. Our experience of that car accident, for example, may well be unique to us, so we may not have had one before. So there's a whole range of emotionality and feelings and things that turn up, which feels incredibly unique. But if you turn to the great bodies of knowledge, the theologies, the philosophies, the mythologies, and so on and so forth, you'll discover that they profoundly understand and can interpret that experience. And they can give you great wisdom and insight as to what that thing was all about, because the world has been through those things before. So what I learned was that we're never alone. Even in the darkest moments when we think nobody cares or nobody could possibly understand, it's in fact not true. That our history has taught us, and very generous people have written about, and spiritually you could argue people have even come here to teach what it means to be human. And once I started tapping into that line of thought, I never stopped, and I kept reading, and I just kept studying, and I took a greater and greater interest in what it meant to be virtuous, what it meant to be ethical, and it helped me to realize that really was the pathway to happiness. And all life was doing, and all of its adversity, was helping me to understand profoundly what it meant to suffer and what it meant to be compassionate, and that nobody escaped it. Nobody. It didn't matter what the circumstances were, that life was full of hard experiences, but there was merit and value in all of them. And, would we want to go through them? No. I mean, Confucius had this wonderful saying. He said, you learn wisdom one of three ways. He said, you can reflection, which is the noblest form of wisdom. So reflect on previous experience. Imitation is the easiest. So follow your guru, do as you're told by your teacher. Not many Australians will do that. Or experience is the bitterest. And he said, most people learn wisdom through bitter experience. So to come back to my point, where do we derive wisdom from? Well, from the things that we go through. What is wisdom trying to say? It's trying to say, really understand what it means to be happy. What it means to be happy is to be patient, to be kind, to be generous, to be compassionate. And maybe in all of that, the need to be assertive, and the need to be clear and unambiguous, and have the courage to be that way. So compassion is not, I can tell you now, Gayl would attest to this, that compassion is anything but weak. If you need to hold space with your own suffering and the suffering of somebody else, and then act upon it and do whatever you can to alleviate it. And that takes great courage. And the reason that people look at compassion as being weakness is they don't have the courage to be that way themselves. So you'll often see leadership in institutions try and dismiss compassion because they call it weakness and fuzzy. No, they don't have the moral courage or the intestinal fortitude to step up and stand up and say that thing that's happening is harmful or is inappropriate or needs to be dealt with. And I think that's the discourse that we need to reintroduce into organisations with great humility, not pride or arrogance or hubris, but great humility, to start to unpackage what it really means to be happy, and what's really causing the harm in our institutions, and what we might be able to do about it collectively as a shared experience in a shared space.
Fascinating. Yeah, you're so right. I think the world needs it more than ever in the most humble way. I think, as you highlight, it's so easy to dismiss and harden yourself to these issues, but I think so important, especially for first responders, not to. I know we've only got about 10 minutes left, so a couple of quick questions that I just want to try and get to from our audience, and thank you for the questions coming through. Really enjoying them. Gayl, this one's for you. You know, the question's about not being defined by our trauma, but that it sometimes feels like it consumes us. How do we detach from the process and that feeling to move forward?
I think it's one of the really difficult ones to actually detach from it. I think the difficulty is when we allow it to completely consume us. The danger is that we become a victim. And sometimes once we have labelled ourselves as a victim, then we get really stuck. And we now have an identity as a victim. And so, and the longer we hold on to that, the more we can actually feel afraid to let it go. Because if I let my victimhood go, what am I? How do I count? How does anybody acknowledge me? How does anybody take any notice of me? It can almost feel like annihilation of our very selves to let go of our victimhood. And yet, if we stay locked in our victimhood, then we are going to be destroying ourselves, because we've cut off so much of our life and the joy and contentment that is possible in life. I tend to focus more on feeling a deep sense of joy in life and contentment rather than happiness. Happiness tends to be thrown around so much these days. There's all sorts of seminars on how to be happy and things like that. And I think one of the things that for many people, if we can, when we come to realise that we are allowing ourselves to be confined and trapped by being a victim, one of the ways I believe that we can take a step forward is to actually reflect on outside ourselves. I think that we can be in grave danger of just focusing intensely on ourselves and our pain. But if we can actually take a step outside ourselves, and engage in what I call grateful thankfulness, where we can actually start by even going, every day just saying thank you for something. And, for me, it's to God, but if, even if you don't believe in a higher power, then gratefully acknowledging that today the sun shone, or today the rain came. We needed rain and it came. Or thank you that I had enough food for today. Really basic sort of stuff is a start to actually looking outside ourselves and not being just utterly consumed by that. And many years ago, I suffered from clinical depression, and that was the first steps I made in actually progressing to some sort of healing of that.
And just coming back to some of your earlier comments, Gayl, especially in the context of what you call moral injury, how important is forgiveness in that, and why, what does forgiving mean, and what's the value of it?
Well, I think the biggest value in forgiveness is for ourselves, which sounds very selfish, but while we are feeling unforgiving of somebody, we are the ones that are actually suffering. We're creating more suffering for ourselves. Most of the time, even if it's been a deliberate act, a lot of things that people do or things we suffer from are unintentional. It usually doesn't feel like that because we seem to think that other people should have the same script that we have, and when they go off script, and you can be very distressed. But if we can possibly move to forgiveness, then we actually let go of all the hooks that hook into us. So we're the ones suffering and feeling upset and damaged and the ongoing distress. And the person who probably did the act is probably sort of going on in their life without giving us a thought. So we hardly cross their minds, maybe. They're certainly not dwelling on what the wrong they did to you, because if they were, you would have had that discussion. They might have come back and said, oh, look, I'm really worried that I've disrupted our friendship or our relationship because I did this and you seem distressed by it. So it hopefully would have been worked out. But I think for me, you know, to actually be able to forgive somebody is to let go of all those expectations. It's not about forgetting, and it's not about giving somebody a free ticket that they're allowed to do whatever they like. It's actually about us living out to our best ability a life that doesn't get destroyed every time by the same things. And of course, for me, it's about praying. But I've said to people sometimes, you know, because I deal with a lot of people from, you know, they're not in any sort of spoken faith tradition. They're deeply spiritual, but they're not that, you know, they can actually start, if they want to, by just commending the person to a higher power and just saying, even if it's through gritted teeth, you know, Gayl. And that can actually start a whole process of where you can let go of the pain.
Fabulous. Oh, I could speak with you for so much longer. Just, Mark, sorry to do this to you, but we've just got 3 minutes left, and I think a really important question has come in that if we can sort of truncate it. The question is the difference between moral injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And you've spoken very bravely today about your experience with PTSD. And, you know, I think the importance of anger in moral injury. And how do you differentiate the two?
I think my post-traumatic stress for me was just being overwhelmed by circumstances in life that, you know, it was a culmination of circumstances, and the tipping point was the 94 fires in Sydney. As an operational commander, you know, on the fire ground, and not being able to do as much as I wanted to do. So having you know, almost like a sense of guilt, I suppose, that, you know, should have done more. But it was really the and I think most PTSD is in fact the culmination of a range of things. And I think part of PTSD is really about, we think we know ourselves, but we don't. And PTSD is like a rending. It's a ripping open to say, look, actually, you don't know who you are, so I'm going to show you violently. So I'm going to rip you open, and I'm going to let you put yourself back together again. And that's how I describe PTSD. And so that's a long process, and it's a painful journey. And we do get there. We often get there with the need of a lot of support and help and guidance, spiritually, psychologically, you know, physically, mentally, relationally, so on and so forth. So it's mythology has a lot to say about it, actually, but I can't express that in 90 seconds. But so that's what I'd say about PTSD. I think moral injury is more about, it is about a sense of clear right and wrong for us, I think. So as Gayl said, we see behaviours that are inconsistent with our own moral compass or our own ethical premise. The reasons we joined an organisation are not, and the reasons that were promoted are not lived. So there's a gap between the lived commitments and what is being espoused, or we're asked to do something that's immoral in our minds. So we end up in an act of amorality or immorality, which we can't reconcile with. And I think that's the difference. So I think PTSD is really a sense of, you know, overwhelmed, could have done more, didn't do enough, you know, a sense of guilt, sense of shame, all of those sort of things. But it's a rending, it's a ripping open. Moral injury won't rip you open, it'll just make you really angry. And as I said, to temper that, really, you got to find out why. You know, to Gayl's point, most people actually don't intend on being amoral or immoral on some levels. You know, some do. There's no doubt about that. Some need a lot of help in that space. But for the vast majority of the average reasonable person, it's a stumble, a tumble, a trip, or a fall. It's a lack of focus. You know, a distorted intentionality, ignorance. All those things come into play, and, you know, we're all subject to that. I mean, to Gayl's point about forgiveness, I say a lot that you know, really we should learn to forgive ourselves for what it is we did or didn't think, say or do in a set of circumstances, and we should forgive others for exactly the same thing, for the things that they did or didn't think, say or do. We all suffer that. We all suffer that. And so we should grant ourselves forgiveness, and we should grant others forgiveness as well. And then deal with the extremities, you know, through law, through justice, through the mechanisms that we need to, of course. It's not a, you know, it's not a morally free world or a consequence-free world, that's for sure.
Wonderful. Well, we could speak forever. So thank you to both you, Mark and Gayl, for sharing your thoughts, your reflections, your incredible wisdom in the true sense of the word today. Thank you also to our attendees who have joined us today. I'm so sorry that we're limited with time. Just a couple of notes before we go. Firstly, if this conversation has sparked emotion and concerns for anybody, we will be putting up a slide with some places and resources that you can reach out to if for whatever reason you feel you need some support. And secondly, when you exit this summit today, you will see a questionnaire. Now, please take a minute or two only to complete that questionnaire and survey for us. It's just about 5 questions, and it will help us really understand your needs, how valuable conversations like this have been for today, and as we plan for future summits and conversations. So please take just 2 minutes to complete that. You can do that anonymously, and we really appreciate your feedback and contributions. So with that, thank you all so much for today's summit, and we'll look forward to speaking to you in the next session this evening from 6 to 7, which should be really interesting, talking about the value of volunteers. Thanks so much. Bye.